Dr. Jamie Taylor, welcome to the Way of Champions podcast, man. It's great to have you on, and we were having a lovely discussion before we got started, and so I can't wait to dive in here.
Hey John, I'm really looking forward to it. Thanks for having me on.
Thanks, man. Well, as we were talking about beforehand, you're doing all this great research and work in on the theoretical side of coaching and skill acquisition, and then you're out there in the trenches every day coaching and going, yep, great on paper, not so good on grass, right? So, can you just tell people a little bit about who you are and what you do for our listeners so they understand where you're coming from?
Yeah, absolutely. And there's a nice idea, but there's a Kurt Lewin idea that says nothing so practical as a good theory. And I try to embody that with my work. That my role is as a assistant professor at Dublin City University, and I couple that with some coach development work for Grey Matters UK, and also I coach at Leicester Tigers Academy, which is a rugby union team here in the UK. And my main interest really is across three. My main interest remains the same as when I was an early career coach, which is I really want to help people get better. My main vehicle for doing that is by doing research with coaches, for coaches, and alongside it, I get to play around with different ideas in practice. And my fellow coaches will be laughing if they hear our work as being described as in the trenches.
I love it. And in your doctorates in psychology, and I thought, before we dive into the book, you and Dave as well, that's his background. And so my initial thing is like, why are two psychologists writing about skill acquisition? Isn't this the realm of the sports scientists or the kinesiologists or, someone else? Why psychologists writing about skill acquisition?
Well, it's a funny one, and my co-author on the book, Dave Collins, is a psychologist. I am not a psychologist, although my doctorate was in psychology, and I often have this interesting dynamic where let's roughly call psychology understanding what is going on between somebody's ears. And there's going to be lots of people upset with me describing it as that. But if it's mind and body stuff,
Hmm.
and our ability to control our central nervous systems and our ability to change behavior, then I often really struggle to see the distinction between psychology and coaching.
Hmm.
And this is where, and I've actually just got off a call. We're having a discussion about where does psychology stop and where does coaching start. And I think there is really significant overlap, and there probably should be really significant overlap between the two domains. But there are
Hmm.
obviously things that the coach can't necessarily do, but there's also things that the psychologist can't nor necessarily should be doing.
Hmm.
And for that reason, I think that rather than seeing these two different things as they're miles apart, we really should be seeing them overlapping,
Hmm.
particularly, I'd say, when it comes to skill acquisition, because if we aren't helping people to move better in a particular sport, yes, there are other things that we can do as coaches that add tremendous value to people's lives, but that's the predominant reason they're with us, and we probably need to make sure we pay attention to that.
Yeah. And I think someone once said to me, psychology is just the physiology we can't prove yet, which I thought was interesting. And I don't know that that would be everywhere, but I thought that was interesting, right? That, deep down, psychology is the chemical movement of stuff within your brain and your body, whether it's cortisol, whether it's dopamine, whatever. And we're trying to create states where there's more of the good stuff and less of the bad stuff, maybe. And so it is some physiology, but we just can't quite put our fingers on it yet and say, do this, and then you get this, right?
Oh, yeah. And I think that most of psychology has moved a long way from what I just described it as, which is mind stuff and body stuff.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, just in sport, that we tend to see the mind stuff as being psychology and the body stuff being something else. And
Yeah.
as I look, it's part of the essence of what we've got in the book here, as well as we track different ideas and their progression and how they've influenced skill acquisition. But I would definitely suggest that psychology is more than the mind stuff. And I can hear a few psychologists that are unhappy that that their work rests on shaky foundations, and I'll opt out of getting into that one.
Well, I would never. I mean, and what's interesting is I'm reading through your book as well on that thing, and you're discussing some of the, you know, terminology or whatever, the approaches to coaching, the approaches to teaching. Um, I kept thinking as well that I keep going back to like, well, you know, great coaches already do this. They just don't maybe call it this, but they are adaptable. And your book, so the book's sports skill acquisition. Um, and like what got you guys interested in this topic? And then this whole idea of well, let's stick with that, and then I want to talk about it depends.
Well, my interest in this goes right back to when I first started coaching and when I first initially started teaching as well. So I can vividly remember the moment when I decided, right, this is what I want to do with the rest of my life when I'm coaching a 13-year-old boy to play badminton. Now, I don't know anything about badminton, or at least I know my way around a badminton court, and I can help somebody get a slightly little bit better than yesterday, but I don't know badminton. So I'm helping this boy who's really reasonably, I think you describe him as being reasonably low ability relative to his peers, really, really struggling to make any impact whatsoever with the shuttle. And I walked him through some very basic block practice, made the task really, really simple, gave him a bigger racket, and the look on his face when he finally hit this shuttle over the net was the moment I realized, hey, you know what? This is bloody good fun. I would like to carry on doing this.
That's awesome.
And and look, that's what brings me to be interested in this, because in various ways and various forms, that the pursuit of helping people get better has become my life. Now, uh, more broadly than that, the field of skill acquisition, particularly in sport, has found itself amongst different theoretical camps. And it's certainly not my intention to get into the real depths of what those different positions are. But people may have heard of the notion of an information processing approach. People might also have heard of the notion of ecological dynamics
Mhm.
and how those two different theories are impacting on what coaches do.
Mhm.
It would probably be my opinion that we've tended to draw too heavily on those different theories as them having absolute meaning for coaches.
Mhm.
And very often we've ended up saying, look, you have to choose this one or this one.
Right.
And as a result of that, and it would, again, it'd be my opinion that neither of those theories offer an adequate explanation for everything that a coach needs to be able to do.
Yeah.
And that both of those theories offer slightly better things for some places and slightly better things for other places.
Yeah.
For me as a rugby coach, there's lots of elements of rugby that are very similar to, say, to your football,
Yeah.
where we would have to engage in really tight levels of coordination, requiring 11 people, or in my case, 15 people, to act in simultaneous action in order to move the ball up the pitch. Now, for that reason, it gets really difficult to explain that from an ecological dynamics perspective, in my view.
Mhm.
However, just by the same token, it gets very difficult to explain how somebody hits a fastball using an information processing approach. And we can get into the particulars of why that is the case if you want.
Yeah.
But my problem and the genesis of the book is that there's lots of these competing theoretical ideas, but they don't really answer everything that a coach might need to know.
Yeah.
So the idea of the book is saying, well, what might this depend on, and how, for me as a coach, how do I change what I do, change my action based on what's in front of me?
Yeah, you have a quote in the introduction. It's not your guy's quote, but I forget the guy who wrote it, but I wrote it down. It said everything works somewhere, but nothing works everywhere. And and I like that idea. And I think also in the world of social media, coaches can get dragged back and forth between the flavor of the month, and then they never really authentically coach, right? Always, and I'm not saying there's anything wrong. Like you should always be tweaking and looking, but it's like they feel like, oh God, man, I just read that. I'm doing it all wrong. Oh, and then next month I'm doing it all wrong. instead of realizing that this approach is a blend, and in every situation you need, I think you have to think of it as like buckets from different wells, and you have to draw from different wells at different times, to really try to be your best for your athletes. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I completely agree. And that's a really nice quote and idea. It's Dylan William, a British educational researcher.
Hmm.
And effectively, what we've proposed, and again, this is not my idea. It's an idea that's been around for a long while. But we draw on the idea of making sure you're clear with what your intentions to impact an athlete or a participant are. Now, for example, I mean, I would see lots of strength and conditioning coaches or strength coaches, and they would work with an idea of what's the adaptation we're trying to help somebody make here. We're trying to help them get stronger over these movements. We're going to use these rep ranges, and this will elicit this adaptation if we do it for this long period of time. I would never hear a strength coach say, right, you're going to get in the gym today and you're going to lift this. And by the end of the session, you're going to be a lot stronger. And what I'm trying to do is make you stronger by the end of the session,
Right.
because they know that it takes longer than that. So so we've framed the idea of how do we decide what it depends on, depending on how do you want to impact the athlete that's in front of you? How do you want to help them change over the short, medium, and long term?
Mm-hmm. Right. So a golf coach whose player has the shanks, my job is to fix the shanks in the next 5 minutes, not rebuild his swing, right? I speak of this from experience as a struggling golfer. But I think that your weight room analogy is a great one. And this really gets down to, I think, the idea where a lot of coaches get stuck is maybe, I would term it, what's the difference between performance and learning, right? We never see learning in the short term, right? We see performance in the short term, and that's where if I block a practice and I hit 57 irons, I'll probably be grooving my 7 iron by the end of it. But then I go out on the golf course and I put my drive into the woods, right? And so it's just that idea is that I can only see learning over time. And I think a lot of coaches struggle with the short-term satisfaction of creating practices that they're calling, you know, technical acquisition or whatever, in ways that shows today they do it, but on Saturday they can't.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's loads of really good research that would show that if practice is easy, 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 then well, we typically don't get that much learning.
Hmm.
And I think if I go back to the intentions idea, one of the things that I consistently see is that if I work with a coach or if I'm next to a coach watching them, they will find it really hard to say, for the same reason that you talked about, how do I know whether my session is going well today?
Mm.
And because we haven't really had a language or a frame of reference to go, this is what I'm looking for, people have gone to two extremes that I see. One of them is, hey, look, they're getting better in the session. And if they're getting better in the session, I make my practice easy, 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 easy game.
Hmm.
Oh, look, they've gotten better. And next week, they probably haven't.
Hmm.
Flip side of that, the story I hear a lot of at the moment is, well, let's make practice messy. Let's make practice ugly.
Yeah.
And that if I see an ugly, messy practice, well, that must mean that they're learning. And I've seen an impact on that, particularly on this side of the water, where effectively practice just becomes messing around in lots of ways.
Yeah.
And neither of those poles, I think, probably offer us enough nuance or for the coach. So if we look at the research, there's some really nice research around challenge points.
Mm-mm.
There's also different research from the mainstream neuroscience literature that would suggest that a challenge point might be, say, 7 or 8 out of 10 success, and I've seen estimates from 7 to 8.5 out of 10.
Hmm.
Now, I'm going to be really clear here as well. I'm saying, right, I'm putting my finger in the air and going, that's a complete estimate. So
Yeah.
if I want long-term learning and retention, it needs to be pretty hard. But that's, to my mind, would also rule out more exploratory practice, the kind of messy practice that we just talked about. And I think that we've got to start seeing a difference between the different types of practice and the different adaptations we might get, where if we're practicing at a good challenge point, we say 7 or 8 out of 10, we might be refining something. But if I want to genuinely explore a new skill, my success rate is going to be much lower.
Yeah.
And as a result, we've probably just got to be clear, what is it that I'm actually trying to do in this session and why am I trying to do it?
Yeah, and then that also is with again the ages and stages and genders of and the pathway of the learner in front of you of is this it, right? Like is this something that they are trying to learn and they're dedicated to learning it? So a challenge point where they're getting 2 out of 10 is acceptable to them in that moment, whereas your young badminton player that you were talking about again, right? Like you want to find a challenge point of something that he can do probably more than 2 out of 10 because he might not make it to 10 reps before he's like, I'm not doing this anymore. This is stupid.
Exactly that, and I think that that principle applies just as much to the badminton player as it does to let's say your golfer is an elite golfer who's having a real struggle on the range the day before that he or she goes and plays a round of golf. We've just got to be really clear what's the purpose of this, and if it's building confidence, then we might take a different route. And I think very often we forget just how important it is that I am confident and competent if I'm going to carry on playing.
Yeah. I mean, and again, as a golfer, I would say that my performance on the range is perhaps the worst indicator of how I'm going to play that day. And I would feel like most golfers would say that. Not the pros, but certainly the amateurs. And so, oh man. Yeah, so I love this. Let me maybe take a step back and say, like, get you to define the book is sports skill acquisition. What's skill and is there a difference for you between skill and technique?
Yeah, so there's a long-standing distinction between skill and technique, and so the typical sorts of definitions for technique would revolve around being able to coordinate somebody's a central nervous system. So I can move and I can perform a movement without necessarily having an environmental stimulus or environmental challenge that would require different changes to timing or rhythm or anything else. Skill. And I've heard it nicely referred to as technique plus context equals skill. So it's matching the demands of the environment or the constraints of the environment to relative to how you coordinate your central nervous system.
Right. So we might say technique is your ability to perform the motor movement and skill is your ability to deploy it in the environment. Would
Yeah,
that be? Yeah.
absolutely.
Yeah. And I think that's, these sometimes get thrown or mixed together. But because again, the more dynamic your sport, when you have an opponent, when you have other conditions, then your skill your training environment matters a lot more. And you have a really interesting thing, and this goes into sort of blends into like teacher centered versus student centered or athlete centered. And you have this nuance between I'm teaching someone how to rappel off a cliff versus creative dance. And I thought that was a really good way to sort of put the two poles of it. Like if I'm teaching someone, or if I'm teaching someone to tackle in rugby for the first time, that's very teacher centered. That's not just go out there and wing it because that's how you get really badly injured. And yeah, you know what? If you're gonna, rock climb, I'm gonna make sure your knot is tied right and your carabiners on and you're doing it the right way before I let you drop off the wall. And so, I mean, talk about that for a second because this all, I think what we're doing is we're building the foundation of all these things. That there are certain sports that require certain techniques before skill can emerge.
Yeah, there's and one of the co-authors on one of the chapters, Mike Ashford, he put it this way. So we took this literature, and there's old ideas from physical education teaching, the spectrum of teaching styles, which is the same idea that you refer to there. Which and what Mike suggested is that you can have uh, instructions from a teacher coach that the player just reproduces and follows. That's a more direct instructional approach. You can also have the opposite end of the spectrum where the athlete is discovering and that the coach is helping them to discover something. And then you've got this middle ground as well. Now, the in the creative dance in the creative dance example, well, it's unlikely that if you would want genuine creative dance, that you can just reproduce what the coach or the teacher is telling you because it's not very creative then.
Hmm.
But by the same token, if we're in a more dangerous set of circumstances, whether it's a tackle in rugby, whether it's rock climbing, it's dangerous to go to the other end of the spectrum and say, well, I'm going to creatively learn how to tackle somebody running as hard as they can at me.
Hmm.
And that's a nice way of illustrating. Look, there's two ends of this pole that we need to pay attention to. And I often think that we get tied up in these ideas that there is one way that is better, that it's better if they discover by themselves. And there is, as far as I'm aware, no evidence to support that. And there's been some pretty robust meta-analyses now that would suggest that there is no evidence in skill acquisition or teaching. However, there's also no evidence the other way, which says that direct coaching and teaching is better as well. And that's where we've got to have this type of nuance.
Yeah, and I mean my example of creative dance that almost brings the two together. I live 30 minutes from a ski mountain. I go up and I look at the kids skiing and snowboarding in the terrain park, and often, more often than not, there is no coach. They're helping each other. It's all athlete led, and the creativity and the advancements that these kids figure out and make it's incredible. And at the same token, it's also very dangerous. And so, there's this thing. But what's also really amazing is, no kid goes out, not no, but, for the most part, they don't go out and try to do, a 720 before they do a 360, before they do a 180. And so kids are also remarkable step-by-step learners as well. Not all of them, but some do that stuff. But when I watch these kids that I know, and luckily my son would much rather photograph them than do the double backflip, which is great. As a dad, it's still I love those in athlete-led environments because that's where I feel like the creativity comes out, and each of those kids has to have, they feel their own body and how it moves through space to figure out how to do it versus a coach sitting there saying, this is exactly how this movement is done.
And I think that's a perfect example of some of the nuance here,
Yeah.
where there's colleagues of mine, including Dave, who co-authored the book, did a study in skateboarding a few years ago and looked at how young skateboarders were tending to learn new tricks and to progress in their sport. And I had the pleasure myself of working with skateboarding for a little while as well. And the thing that really stood out is that in the absence of a defined coach, what lots of people were doing was modeling others. Now that's copying others, but it's also watching Instagram, watching how somebody's doing something and then going and trying it themselves.
Hmm.
Now, I'm looking at that going, that's very often what a coach does in formal sports coaching settings, the use of video analysis, which is watch this, now go and copy this. And it helps us really to go, look, there's nuance here where I, as a coach, don't need to be telling somebody bit by bit by bit how to do something, but I can be providing them with information that they then go and reproduce, and I can help them reproduce against a target model. And that's what in the book we've referred to as the idea of scaffolding, where a coach is providing information for an athlete to model, but it's not highly direct. It's a more of a middle ground between a guided discovery and a more direct command-based approach.
Yeah. And then, I mean, is there really such thing as perfect technique or perfect skill versus, something that's perfectly adopted for the body that I'm working with, right? Michael Phelps might have the perfect body for swimming and can swim a certain way that someone who doesn't have such long arms and torso and short legs isn't going to swim that way, but it can also have a perfectly adopted technique for their body.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And look, I think this is another bit of nuance that I see, which is that the one extreme of that is, well, there's no one perfect technique where every parameter of movement needs to be followed. So what we do is we don't coach them how to move well. The flip side of that is there is good evidence to show that there are certain bandwidths and parameters that people need to follow to fall within in
Yeah.
order to execute a particular movement well. And that's the nuance there for me, where we've got to make sure that we're considering, right, so is this working for this person under these circumstances and will it continue to work? Or might I need them to move closer towards a good model rather than a best model?
Yeah. So, okay, so let's kind of dive into the four parts that you break the book down to controlling movement, learning movement, performing movement, and team movement. And I'm not quite sure how we can approach these in our conversations, but I'll let you go there. Why those four parts?
Well, why the four parts? We wanted to start off by going, look, there's lots of different theoretical orientations here that have been discussed reasonably at length in the literature. And the one that I haven't talked about here is a predictive processing or an active inference approach, which has, if I'm speaking in really rough terms that aren't necessarily accurate, forms a bit of a middle ground between information processing and ecological dynamics. And I don't particularly want to linger here because ultimately the difference between these theories is to what extent do representations form a part of us functioning as human beings, which is something that people have been arguing about since Immanuel Kant turned up in the 1700s, and still haven't been able to find a good answer to it. But the offshoots of all of those have created lots of these nice ideas where that help us understand partial views of movement. And I think it's been a disappointing feature for me of the skill acquisition literature that very often people go, it's this one or it's this one. And if this one is the current one, so you need to follow this one. And I just don't think that's necessarily the case.
Hmm.
Whereas I'd imagine that most coaching that I see tends to operate from a more behaviorist stance, which behaviorism, which effectively is do this well, good boy, good girl, carry on, reinforce it. And we do it again, good boy, good girl, reinforce it.
Hmm.
And as a result, we end up in practice where people repeat it, receive quite a lot of feedback that reinforces, but we don't really ever get beyond the nuance of that.
Yeah.
And we can go back 50 years and see that lots of the recommendations around errorful learning haven't really changed all that much.
Yeah.
So we just wanted to give people a bit of a background on that to start with.
Yeah. And I want to thank you. At 420 podcast episodes, you're the first one who brought up Kant, which brings me back to my Jesuit education roots. So thanks for that. Yeah. So I mean, I think this. I mean, let's talk about some of these specific parts. What is it about, about controlling movement? How do we do this? And like I said, I'm not quite sure how to approach this without going too much into the weeds, um, because I think what our listeners would really love to hear is, well, what does good coaching look like? Right? So I don't go too far one way or the other. Like, yeah.
Well, I'd
And
say
I
the
know the
funny
answer to
thing.
that is it depends. So
Well, the answer does do it depends,
yeah.
and there've been some perhaps rightful critiques of that, where it needs to be followed up with what does it depend on, and that is
Yeah.
essentially what the book offers, which is we lay out a model that we've built from other researchers, particularly in sport coaching.
Hmm.
We've looked at this idea of intentions for impact, the two tools that are available to a coach, which are the way in which you coach, your coaching style, how you change that between more direct and less direct approaches,
Mm.
the types of practice that you design, or whether that's on pitch, on ice, or off it. But those are the only two things that you get to adjust, and that's how you shift the athlete's experience, and it's how you shift how you impact on them over time. And from that point, we then build out and go, well, what are all these other factors that it might depend on? So how might this differ in a team sports setting? How
Yeah.
might this differ with elite athletes? How might it differ with beginner athletes? And we start to build out a bit of a picture that goes, oh, look, there's quite a lot more going on here necessarily than just right, you move here, do this, do that.
Yeah. And I mean the list of what might this depend on is got to be dozens of things, right? Like I think about what the cultural aspect. If I'm coaching football, soccer in Brazil versus Norway, that might be very different of, what those athletes culturally are going to want from their coach in that moment, the weather, the so many things. And so yeah, it's such a vast thing that I don't want coaches to go, oh my God, like I'll never quite wrap my head around all of this. So what do what do you suggest? Like, how do you define for yourself, Jamie? Like, okay, I just ran practice last night. Was it a good practice?
Well, I'd start by saying I don't think we are ever going to get to a point where we've have fully wrapped our heads around this. It's a
Hmm.
really complex, difficult thing to do, and we
Hmm.
can understand it better. And that's certainly my intention. That's where I've spent a lot of my life. But I definitely caution people in going, right, I know how to do this now. I've found the secret sauce. I've found the recipe because that's probably never going to exist.
Yeah.
So what, and this is our suggestion, and it's by absolutely no means a solution, but it comes back to this idea of how are you intending to impact somebody? So if I think back to my most recent session, we were actually doing a block of work on helping these are young rugby players who are ambitious. They're not that far off the professional game in England. We're helping them to improve their tackling. Now, in
Mm.
a couple of cases, we are helping them to actively expand their skill set.
Mm.
So my intention to impact them with a few differences individually was particularly framed around how do we expand your ability to understand how you change your feet and how you change your footwork into different types of tackles. We're
Mm.
asking them to draw deliberate, conscious attention to how their feet are moving before a tackle.
Hmm.
Now, that for me forms a one of the objectives of that session, and obviously we arrive at that intention for all sorts of different reasons, but that provides then a bit of a guidance for me and a bit of a way of framing what am I watching here? I should probably be seeing pretty highly errorful practice.
Hmm.
And because I'm helping them to actively expand, they're going to be using information from me in order to reproduce something. So they're
Hmm.
reproducing what they've seen on video prior to the session and also reproduce my knowledge as a coach.
Yeah.
Now, that there helps direct what I do and the effectiveness of the practice, at least in the short term.
Yeah. Now, the same in that example, which again is like that is a very highly nuanced technique. I remember this summer I was working at a ice hockey conference and there were some NHL coaches talking about, you know, defensive angles in, the neutral zone or whatever. And I was just so incredibly impressed of the nuance of the angle and the stick and all the sort of things that worked. And I'm like, and that doesn't apply to 90% of the coaches in here. It's fascinating. But they're so far from that right there. But what about the challenge when a player is successful, aka they make the tackle, but their footwork was still wrong. And then that role of the coach is to say that worked today, but it's not going to work in the long term when players get bigger, faster, stronger. Just like a young player playing soccer can tow a ball and much further than they can hit it with their laces, but over long term, that's not going to be successful.
Well, that's a perfect example of where the options open up to us, where
Yeah.
if we have the ability to increase the challenge points and it is safe to do so, then that's probably one of the best ways of going, look, this is not working for you. How do we do that? Now that could be we increase the numbers, we increase the decision-making demand on a player before they perform an action.
Hmm.
It could be that we simply get a better player to run at them with the ball. Or we can video them and show them, look, compare this to this good practice model.
Right.
Or we tell them that you're going to have a problem if you keep doing it like this. All of those options are available to us. But I think it's interesting that for me as a coach, there's a nice idea called curriculum knowledge. Curriculum knowledge is I've got an idea of the different content and what it looks like over time.
Hmm.
And I work with a really, really good community coach,
Hmm.
and she works with 12, 13-year-old boys and girls. And her understanding of that setting and where they're at is so much superior to mine that I can't walk into that setting and go, right, I know rugby,
Yeah.
so I'm going to coach you to do these things. I've got to have an appreciation of where they are and what's going to function appropriately in that environment at that particular time.
Yeah.
But ideally, I probably want to know a bit more about the journey that somebody's going to go on. To do
Yeah.
my job, I need to understand what it looks like at a world-class level
Yeah.
because that's where the
And
players I'm coaching
and
want to
then,
go.
like you said, you're at, Leicester, where it's like, okay, they are in an environment where they're, for the most part, aspiring to become a professional rugby player. And so to break it down that much versus a community rugby team where, you know what, I get to hang out with my mates 3 nights a week is very different of I want to keep you safe, but I'm not going to stop all practice until everyone gets their footwork right here in this moment.
No, and also I would discourage people from doing that anyway, because
Yeah.
uh, if because I've got to figure out who am I catering to here, and I'm still looking for a highly errorful practice that's difficult,
Yeah.
and that I don't necessarily want everybody to be doing it really well because I want to elicit a challenge point that yields long-term learning and transfer.
Yeah, yeah. All right. So we kind of went on a tangent there of how you define a successful practice. So one component, we're learning something new here. So I want to see a lot of errors. What's another component of a successful practice for you?
So all of it again comes to me is intention. So you might not necessarily like the badminton example. You might want less errorful practice, and that's where I think that some of the really good recommendations around having highly errorful practice aren't necessarily always the same across every session. I think one of the key things a coach has got to do is decide one, how many errors are desirable. So
Hmm.
how big a challenge do we want them to have?
Mm.
And then two, how do we want them to be challenged? Do we want them to be challenged by the different actions they're taking? That is, how real are these actions against what they do in the game? Do we want them to be challenged strategically? That is, I'm managing the game, I'm trying to outwit somebody. Do I want them to be challenged physiologically? Are they having to work really hard here? Or are we challenging them affectively or having to manage my emotions? Or I'm just simply loving being involved and playing the game. So I'd say how many errors and what's challenging them. And once we've got a picture of that, we can start playing with all sorts of combinations of what good looks like.
Yeah. And I think again in the it depends realm of things, right? The kids on the professional track, which is a small percentage, versus everything else from intro to community to, a higher level of club or school, but not necessarily professional, are all looking at that a little bit, a little bit differently, because on those other tracks, the skill, the ability of those athletes is often very different, right? So once we're coaching team sports versus coaching a tennis player, is how do I create this environment that is an appropriate challenge to all levels of learners? That's the hardest thing about coaching, I think, community sports, is all levels of learners, all levels of motivation. And oftentimes those are our least experienced coaches that get thrown in with, I think, some of the most challenging groups.
And indeed, there's some recent research that I've been part of that would say exactly the same thing, that the challenge of meeting all of these different people is really, really difficult.
Yeah.
And I'd suggest it's worth just having an idea. What is this bit here aimed at? Who is this chunk of a session aimed at? And you can adjust based on that, because you might see little Jilly struggling with something over here. You might see uh, uh, little Johnny over here also finding something difficult, but for different reasons. And it enables you to act in accordance with what you might think that they need in the moment.
Yeah.
But and look, there's also the other side of things, which is we're talking about here about motor skill, because that's what the book is, but it's not the only reason that people come to sport.
Yeah.
And that we've also got to consider that idea of and lots of your guests have spoken of this, but the idea of the education of the physical, that is, we're getting better at moving, or there's education through the physical,
Mhm.
which fundamentally is the reason that I'm sat here talking to you now, because I had some outstanding coaches that
Mhm.
helped shape my life and shape the person that I am today. And I think it's important not to forget that bit as well.
Yeah. Whew. So let me throw some other ideas out at you and feel free to poke as many holes in them as you want. Um, I think I got to the point after 30 years of coaching where I defined a successful practice, and I never looked at it. I love the way you look at it, like, how many errors, what's the level of challenge for this? I learned a lot about that during COVID when the athletes here where I lived in the middle of the hot summer had to wear masks while trying to play. And I had to solicit a lot of feedback of, is this an appropriate duration, intensity of activity for trying to breathe through a mask at, 95 degrees Fahrenheit, right? And so I they really tweaked the way that I coached a lot during that time. But I came down to sort of I think a couple of things. Number one, this like this at the end of practice, was there enough challenge that there was a little bit of frustration out there that we can't get it. Um, Number two, I would ask myself, when I was a player, would I have wanted to be a part of this practice? Right? Is this something that I would have got? And number three, I always felt I kind of nailed it when, I said, all right, that's it. Pick up the goals, move the goals, pick up the cones, whatever. That the guy's like, wait, we're done? Right? That they're in this flow state, that it's just going and moving. And they're like, whoa, that was 90 minutes. That's when I was like, okay, if there was that difficulty, that challenge, that competitiveness, that game, and then they couldn't believe that they had just spent 90 minutes, that I kind of that was pretty good, and they'd come back tomorrow. So poke any holes in that you want.
Well, I love that idea, because ultimately, in it doesn't matter what domain we're in, we desperately want people to want to practice, and we want them to keep coming back. And I really like that idea that I'm practicing, but I don't want this to be over. I think that's a really, really nice indicator. The the bit around challenge point and frustration, I think, is also an interesting one, because I would argue that for most practices, and if we're having a blanket recommendation, I think there's some good work on this, and I think that's what the challenge point theory does offer. You have a blanket recommendation that says, ideally, you want practice to be a little bit frustrating. You want it to be at a reasonably high challenge point, but people are for the most part, are overcoming that challenge.
Hmm.
I think that's a pretty robust and reasonable idea that, is a nice rule of thumb. What I hope that we've done with these intentions for impact is start going, look, that's a good rule of thumb, but actually you might direct it slightly elsewhere, just depending on what you're looking to try and achieve here. The other nice one that I've heard quite a few times is, how many one-to-one conversations have I had?
Mm,
in this session?
love it.
How many individuals have I gotten information from and learned about them? I think that that and the last one you've offered are two really nice, pretty standard things that you could probably put into any coaching session anywhere.
Yeah, awesome. And just writing that one down because it's certainly in 400 plus podcast episodes when we talk to coaches on here and say, what if you could go back and do it again? And these are people who are in the Hall of Fame and have won professional titles and World Cups and Olympics and everything. What would you have done more of? And the answer is always one-on-one meetings, right? So these could be meetings over time, but also one-on-one interactions. And when I've watched, I mean, the best coach I've got to watch work in person that people would know would be Pep Guardiola. And it was the master of the one-on-one interaction, right? And just watching him train his team and it's just individual comments. When the whistle blew to take a break or get some water, grab this player, boom, with 30 seconds, or over here, 30 seconds. That's where all the magic was happening. And I think that last metric is one that I hadn't thought of and might be the most important one. So I basically blew it the last 30 years.
Hey, we've clearly been doing a terrible job. Now, and look, I think, and also the bit that I think is so important in that is that if you are speaking to people individually, you start to understand what's going on for them. And until that point, it's really difficult to realize just how differently people take different bits of practice and how differently people experience things. And that can be for all sorts of different reasons, but that could be a psychological thing, it could be a skill set thing, it could be a cultural thing, it could be. But until we really start understanding what's the essence of where this person's coming from, I think it is really difficult to coach them well.
Yeah, and that's it, right? Who's in front of me? What do they need? And some of them have never gotten a hug, and that's what they need, and some of them have never had any discipline, and that's what they need, and that let's I hate to say this to, like, but that's the art of coaching. That's the it depends in a nutshell. And I really think again, what I liked about the book was this idea that we have all these approaches, but if you become married to one so much so that you don't see what's in front of you, then you're not coaching your very best.
I think that's a lovely way of putting it.
Yeah. Any final thoughts? And then I want just you to let people know how to connect with you. But any way to sum this up for our coaches who listen to this, some who are professional, some who are grassroots and coaching their kids' team for the first time.
Well, I think that so if I look across the coaches that I've seen in practice, very often some of the best ones are the ones who are not getting paid for what they do.
Mm.
And I would never, ever underestimate the expertise of somebody who is working either with children or just working and not getting paid. And I think that for us as coaches, that we've got a real responsibility to raise the bar with what we expect and what's normal in our worlds. And I would hope that regardless of wherever you are, that the ideas that we've talked about here, and perhaps the ideas in the book, are useful in that work backwards from how you intend to impact somebody. And I think that things will probably just get that little bit easier for you. They're certainly never going to be easy, but they might just get a little bit easier.
Yeah, I love that, and for all those grassroots coaches, I also always tell them my favorite Richard Bailey quote, which is volunteerism is not an excuse for lack of professionalism. So I like that as well. Tell people how they can get the book, and also what's the best ways to connect with you.
So the book is available at all good booksellers, I believe, and it's Sports Skill Acquisition. It's by
From Human
myself and
Kinetics, right?
yeah,
Correct.
from
Yeah, yeah.
Human Kinetics,
Yep.
and myself and Dave Collins, co-editors of the book, and I'm on social media, whether it's LinkedIn or whether it's on Twitter X, and I'm sure that you'll be able to share different links to different things in the show notes.
Yeah, we'll share all those links, share where you can get the book and everything. This was a great discussion. Thank you so much for carving out the time today. And I think taking what can be a very difficult and in the weeds topic and distilling it down as simply as possible. And I think anyone listening to this can go, okay, yeah, I got it. How can I go out there today and make my practice the best? And some really good stuff. So, Jamie, thanks so much and best of luck with the book.
No, thanks, John, and I'm just pleased to be able to get a mention of Immanuel Kant in there.
Take care. Thank you all for listening. Thanks to Jamie Taylor. All his contact info is in the show notes. And the book is Sports Skill Acquisition. I thought it was a really interesting discussion. And if you read the book, you can see how you can get really into the weeds on this with some of the terminology and things. But I think he just did a really excellent job of how can we simplify it? How can we define success in practice? What are those components? Do I want to be part of that? The number of one-on-one interactions huge, and I really love that idea of how many errors do I want to see? What is this level of challenge? And then building my training around that. So the numbers and the sizes and the intensity and all that sort of stuff. And I think anyone can take that and use that. So thank you to Jamie. Go out there, grab that book. Thank you to all of you who have become premium members of Changing the Game Project. It's been really awesome to have people sign up and dive in. It's been awesome to get this out to a couple of the organizations that I've done recent speaking with, because this is now a value add for all speaking engagements that all your parents, all your athletes, all your coaches get access to our best content organized for you. So you can go to the website, become a premium member, or you can email me, John at changingthegameproject.com, and let me know about if you want to set up your entire organization or have me come in and speak as well. All right. Thanks to our amazing friends and supporters at Sprocket Sports. If you need that new website, if you need that new registration tool, go to sprocketsports.com, set up a meeting, tell them you heard about them on the Way of Champions podcast. And thank you to all of our Patreon podcast champions as well, the people who support this podcast. They are now all premium members as well. So if you join in Patreon, you're getting that annual membership thrown in as well. All our best stuff, much more than Patreon used to give. Okay. But for now, remember your influence is not neutral. And one of the best ways to influence your practice is to really think about what is the skill we're going to acquire today, and how many errors and how many challenges and how many interactions can I have? So go out there and use that influence for good. And we'll see you again next week, everyone.